the co-founder of GovLab, and so we are an action research center focused on how do we improve the way we make decisions. Oops, Stefan, and the there we go. So this should work now, I presume, and so we are looking into how do we transform the way we make decisions in society, leveraging new technologies, and indeed, data has been one of the core focus areas on how can we leverage data in order to transform the way we go about solving public problems, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's climate change or whether it's urban mobility or any other kind of topic that currently is, of course, challenging us. And one of the key realizations in doing so, next slide, please, Stefan, is that we obviously have seen a massive datafication in society. We have a lot more data than we've ever had before. And the data is both unique as it relates to its variety, right? So we have data that is structured, unstructured, semi-structured, and resides either within telecom organizations or within banks or within government. And that also, of course, there is a massive kind of velocity, right? So the whole aspects related quite often to big data is, of course, something that we cannot ignore. But one of the key challenges that we have, in addition to perhaps challenges with regard to preventing misuse of datafication that results from the digital transformation, one of the key challenges is that we see also a massive divide between those that have data, i.e. the supply of data, and those that need data. And that could be researchers, but it could, of course, also be policymakers. It could be other startups. It could be non-profit organizations, and so on. And so we have a quite substantial asymmetry, a data asymmetry, between those that have data, because they quite often have access to the instrumentation to collect data, and those that need data in order to improve the way we go about managing and governing society. And so one of the key focus areas that we've had at GovLab is to really focus on how do we bridge that divide? How do we make sure that we actually start collaborating between the demand and the supply of data in order to generate insight that can benefit society? And that's where, next slide, we have for the last few years, we have focused on the concept of data collaboratives, a new kind of partnerships between those that have data expertise, and those that need insight or access to the data in order to reuse the data that was quite often collected for a particular purpose, for other purposes, and of course, our interest is mainly public interest purposes. And so what we've been doing at GovLab, we've been experimenting as an action research and actually establishing data collaboratives, but we've also been studying what are the variety of examples and options that one has when one wants to bridge the supply and demand of data in society. And so if you go to the website, datacollaboratives.org, which is one of our flagship initiatives, there you will find the largest repositories of examples, and you will also find our methodologies that we have applied with regard to establishing data collaboratives. And what I will do first is share a few examples and a few insights from doing all that work. But then what I really would like to do is to hone in on some of the challenges that holds us back, because obviously while we've seen a lot of experimentation as it relates to data collaboratives, we really still have a long way to go in order to make it the default, or in order to make it easier and lower the transaction cost of actually setting up data collaboratives. And that's where we actually, the last 2 to 4 years, have really started focusing on how do we make it easier and more impactful to actually set up some data collaboratives. Next slide. Now, the first key takeaway is that there is no one way of setting up a partnership between a data holder and the ones that want to use data, and that we really, as a society, have to become more sophisticated about the different ways of actually going about setting up a data collaboration. And so we have identified about 6 types of data collaboratives, and I will show that within each type, you also have then a variety of actually implementations. But those 6 types differ according to the spectrum of openness. Some are more open with regard to how you have access to data. Others are more restricted, where you actually have concrete conditions under which you can access certain kinds of data, and only a few might actually be eligible to touch the data. And then the other axis is really about the level of partnership. In some cases, you have open access, and anyway, you don't have to actually really engage with the data holder. In other cases, you have anyway open access, but it's really directed and it's in a close collaboration fashion with the data holder as well. And so based upon those, we have seen 6 kinds of data collaborations emerge, and then of course hybrids in between. And they range from public interfaces to trusted intermediaries to ultimately what we will see initiatives where actually no data is being shared, but where the intelligence of the data is shared, which is in itself quite often sufficient for governance as well. Next slide. So what I will do is very briefly show anyway examples of the 6, and again, I'm not gonna, this is not meant to go really into detail about anyway all the examples that exist and options that exist with regard to data collaboration. That would in itself be almost a full day kind of exercise. But what I will anyway give a flavor of actually the diversity that is existing, and I would argue that the diversity is a good thing. We actually do need have a plural approach to data collaboration, and not just assume that one model, such as for instance a data trust, will actually suffice for all purposes. I think we need to be really more creative in thinking about different versions of data collaboratives. Anyway, the first version is the one that typically gets, when you talk about data collaborations, that people typically imagine, which is where you bring different data sets together in some kind of a data pool, right? And so data pooling is a typical, of course, phenomenon of data collaboratives. But here, then you have different versions, right? And it ranges from, for instance, cross-institutional data pools, such as shared streets, which is a data collaborative where you bring in different observational data with regard to, for instance, urban street patterns, to, for instance, HDX, or the Humanitarian Data Exchange, which is a data platform where you have access to different types of data sets as well, to ultimately data cooperatives, right, which is then specifically governed in a kind of a cooperative fashion, which is more of kind of a club good kind of approach as well. The next slide, please, is then, for instance, prizes and challenges, which is also kind of a data collaborative exercise where a data holder puts a data set on a particular kind of server, makes it open to those that want to experiment with how to make sense of it. And so you see the matching of demand and supply, but it's through a prize and a challenge. And so in some cases, we've seen like open innovation challenges, and typically those open innovation challenges lead into longer term collaborations once you have identified who actually has the capacity to make sense of the data. So for instance, BBVA, the Spanish bank, has done a lot of open innovations with regard to their data to, for instance, understand urban challenges. Or Turk Telecom data has done this to an open innovation challenge to try to use telecom data for migration patterns, for instance. And of course, in Taiwan, for instance, we have the annual presidential hackathon where they set up data collaboratives, and then the result is actually a data collaborative that emerges from the inside, and it's using quite often privately held data as well. Next slide. The other is, of course, research partnerships, which is well established, and of course has a particular kind of audience in mind. But again, these are research partnerships quite often that provide access to private sector data, which otherwise would not be made available. And so it ranges here, for instance, from having data fellowships with telecom operators, including, for instance, data research initiatives like MasterCard has a whole initiative where they have data fellows that can make sense of MasterCard data in order to, for instance, understand economic patterns, to ultimately, of course, research data portals. And we've seen plenty of those, of course, emerge during COVID-19 as well. Next slide. Other types of data collaboratives are then the more, where they actually have a public interface. And quite often this is, of course, more aligned with open data, where there is less of a partnership model, but where you actually can just have access to data. But still, there is quite often a condition still attached to that. And it ranges from, for instance, TomTom that has an API, but then still controls who has access to it in order to, use their data for instance, monitoring floods or identifying and preventing disasters. To, for instance, Opal, which is a modular analytical approach to not, where there is no data being shared, but then the algorithm goes to the data through a technical means as well. And of course, you also still have web scraping quite often that is tolerated. And of course, a recent court decision, for instance, has also identified that, for instance, web scraping of LinkedIn is totally legal. And of course, that also will then has an impact on actually how LinkedIn is going to probably make it even more feasible instead of and conditional quite often as well. Next slide. Now, the other where there is more of a controlled environment is quite often through trusted intermediaries, right? So, for instance, the example here is Data Ventures, which is a very interesting trusted data intermediary, which is organized by the New Zealand Statistical Agency, and they manage privately held data, such as telecom data, for other purposes. And so they are the ones that determine who can have access to it, for what purpose, and so on. And we have a whole range of other initiatives here as well. And of course, under the Data Governance Act in Europe, we will see a lot more of those kinds of intermediaries that are, trying to manage private data, sometimes, of course, donated by individuals in order to generate insights that you otherwise would not be able to have. Next slide. We also, and this is, ultimately the other spectrum, right? So from, the public interface to ultimately what we have here, which is where no data is quite often shared, but where private sector actors are generating insight and then share the insights with the wider world. And so that ranges, for instance, in JP Morgan. You have JP Morgan Chase Institute, which is what I call a data tank, a new kind of think tank using data. And what they do is they use the data from the largest bank here in the US in order to generate insight with regard to how economic and financial trends are occurring in the US. And so they, I would say, are far more advanced quite often than the economic statistical agencies, because obviously they have much granular and more real-time kind of data than statistical agencies might have. And so they are an amazing complementary kind of source to steer the economy and to understand, for instance, the impact of COVID-19 on households, to know, if you talk about circular or platform economies, they actually do know how much, for instance, Uber drivers actually earn, and as a result have a clear understanding on what the platform economy and gig jobs are actually really about, right? Same thing for LinkedIn, for instance. They have the economic graph, so they don't share any data, but they share the insight, for instance, with the evolution of skills as well. And same, Uber has done this as well. And we see a trend among many corporations that are trying to enter the data collaborative space, where they're thinking about reusing their data for other purposes. And quite often they start off with their own internal research team, of course, in order to share the data. And we will probably see a lot more of those. And I call this still data collaboratives, because quite often the level of collaboration is then at the level of who asks the question, right? and what are the kinds of questions that they are. And you could actually set up a collaboration here with regard to questions. Now, obviously, data scientists are not happy with those kinds of arrangements because they cannot touch the data. Having said that, for society, I think it's definitely a worthwhile development that we need to take notice of. Next slide. Now, the other big observation, right, besides the fact that there is massive diversity, and again, what I always try to emphasize in our work is that none of those, anyway, are superior, right? It all depends on the purpose and depends on the context in which they are operating. Now, we can argue that, anyway, for some, we should have more access. For others, we should, anyway, be more engaged with actually the data subjects and so on. But it suffices to say is that one of the key challenges is to really start thinking about how do we actually develop data collaboratives that are fit for purpose, and what are the variables that comes into play, because the realization of doing and developing data collaboratives is that there are a massive amount of variables that come into play when you design a data collaborative. And we really need to become more sophisticated about how do we structure a data collaborative that is fit for purpose, because quite often we have seen that data collaboratives are created, like for instance a public interface, but then no one is using the data or no one knows what to do with it. And so we really need to think about, anyway, what is the level of openness that we need to have? Do we have it on-site, online? Is it open access? Is it restricted? Is it pre-processed data? Is it just the insights that we share? Is it a single data provider? Is it multiple data providers that we bring in a pool? Is it a single data set? Is it multiple data sets? And so there is X amount of variables that comes into play to structure a data collaborative. And we really need to develop kind of a new methodology. And that's also what we have been working on, to really think about the aspects that comes into play. Next slide. Now, because of this huge variability and complex, multi-layered aspects with regard to structuring a data collaborative, we've also seen that it's very hard to scale data collaboratives. And so there are quite some costs involved, despite the fact that, of course, we are talking about reusing data that was collected. So the collection costs are, of course, minimum because we are reusing data. But that does not mean that, of course, there are no other costs involved. And we actually don't really have a good understanding on what does it take, what are the costs to actually set up a data collaborative, which means that quite often we don't have a really good sustainability strategy as well. But more importantly, most of those initiatives are quite often one-offs. So there are pilots and they never scale. So we need to make it more systematic. And then also, of course, there are quite some risks involved, both from, anyway, the data holder. If you're a corporation and you're sharing your data, then quite often there might be risks from both reputation, but also commercial risks. But of course, there are also privacy risks involved as well. And so what we have been, and which is the topic and the title of today's presentation, what we've been focusing on is to how do we actually make those data collaborations more systematic beyond the pilot, sustainable, i.e., anyway, have some kind of a business model attached to it, or at least a funding stream that goes beyond thinking that this is all a public good, because public goods are famously hard to sustain. And how do we make them also responsible so that they are trusted and that they really add value to society as well? And so what I will reflect on are a few foundational pieces that we feel need to be in place in order to make them more systematic, sustainable, and responsible. And I deliberately didn't focus much on the technical aspect, which is, of course, important as well. But the realization is that quite often it's actually a lot more than just technical challenges that we have in order to make them systematic, sustainable, and responsible. And it really requires some kind of a cultural change, but also a new set of methodologies and professions in order to do so as well. Next slide. And so the first element that we have focused on is really to strengthening the demand for data collaborations. Because as I mentioned, we started this journey by really focusing on the asymmetry that exists in society between those that need data and those that have data. But what we quickly came to the realization is that actually the demand side is quite often very poorly formulated. And as a result, either the supply side is very reluctant, or one establishes a data collaborative and then subsequently generates insights, and it turns out the insight is actually marginal. We don't have the insight that we actually really needed because we didn't spend enough time on formulating the demand side. And of course, when we talk about data, the demand side typically needs to be formulated in, and of course we have models and so on. I'm not going to go into detail there, but typically should be formulated in terms of a question, right? A question that is associated with a problem that data can answer, because data, to a large extent, the real and the quite often only value of data is, of course, that it manages to answer questions and generates insights, right, that then can be acted upon. Now, as a society, we are actually really bad in formulating questions. And as a result, we start from the data, try and assume that the data will give us answers or even give us the questions without really thinking through what are the questions that matter. And then as a society, we can organize ourselves with regard to the data we need to answer those questions that matter. And so what I've been working on for the last 2 to 3 years is really what I call a new science of questions that can complement data science, and that then subsequently can make data collaboratives far more valuable, because at least you start from the question, not from the data, when you establish a data collaborative. And so the initiative where we are testing out this new science of questions is called the 100 Questions Initiative, where we try to identify the 100 questions that matter across 10 domains. It ranges from migration to gender to urban mobility, which we just kicked off this week, to future of work and so on. And I think the realization here is that we really need a more participatory way to formulate questions that can generate data collaboratives. And here we are creating what we call cohorts of bilinguals, people that have a domain expertise and a data expertise, in order to source that cohort that then can formulate the questions that will be important to have answered through data collaboratives. And so here, instead of formulating and identifying what they call in Europe high-value data sets, we are actually identifying high-value questions for which we then can, of course, have high-value data sets as well. And so the first foundational piece that can make data collaboratives more systematic is by actually starting with the questions. The next slide, please. Then once you have the question, then of course you do need to engage with the supply side. And it turns out that we also have not really professionalized the response to solicitations for data. And so here we've been calling for a new profession, especially within the supply side, whether that's the private sector or whether it's the public sector, that can respond in a professional way to, in a professional meaning a methodological way and transparent way to solicitations for data. Because one of the biggest challenges that we have in today is that if you need data and you have a well-formulated demand, for instance, during a crisis, or anyway, when you are really trying to improve the quality of your cities, the question then is, of course, who do you even ask, right? I mean, we do a lot of work with the private sector, and we have many people knocking on my door each time asking, so anyway, we would like to work with Corporation X, who should we contact? And then most of the time I have to say, good luck finding out, because there is no function within data holders quite often that have a mandate, let alone a capacity to respond to solicitations around the data. And so absent that kind of function, which we call chief data stewards, it's very hard to establish a data collaborative. because there is no one that really owns and has an understanding on how to deal with those multiple variables in actually shaping a data collaboration. And so we have been working on what we call reimagining, because data stewardship already exists as a concept, but reimagining data stewards as individuals or teams or functions, right, or roles that really look into how to establish data collaboration in a more systematic, sustainable, and responsible way. Next slide. And turns out this is not one, of course, competency that one needs. Clearly, we need a competency in understanding what data can do, and what data resides, and what the questions are that can be answered with the data one has. But it also involves competencies with regard to structuring partnerships, including, for instance, setting up data sharing agreements, which is still the main way to actually quite often de-risk a partnership. But also it means being able to internally build a business case for data sharing, right? Because what are the incentives to actually setting up data collaboration from the private sector's point of view depends on the business case, right? And data stewards are uniquely positioned to actually formulate that business case. But it also, anyway, involves functions with regard to then taking the insight and turning it into action, and so on. Next slide. Now, this was also a key recommendation, as was mentioned by Stefan at the beginning. I'm also a member of the expert group to the European Commission on business to government data sharing. I'm also now a member of the expert group to Eurostat, which is the European statistical system on accessing private sector data for statistical purposes. And in both kinds of and the report for the second expert group will be released in May. But the key recommendation of the expert group to the European Commission was indeed that we actually do need to have that new kind of function of data stewards. And we will see now that the Data Act, which actually provides a mandate within Europe, it's a proposed mandate, it's not yet fully implemented, of course, but the Data Act in Europe, which was released in February, has now a proposed mandate to access privately held data in exceptional conditions. And that, of course, will require that most private sector companies in Europe will have to invest in a new function that can respond to those kinds of solicitations. And that's, of course, where data stewardship will come in as well. So strengthening the demand side, strengthening the supply side, and especially investing in the human infrastructure to facilitate data collaboration is what we believe are two important efforts to make data collaboration more systematic. Next slide. We also, by the way, have an executive course now for data stewards, where we already have trained multiple data stewards in the private sector and in the public sector, both within, for instance, statistical agencies or within city governments, for instance, that really have a role to set up those data collaboration, because clearly, if you want to use data for decision making, you're going to have to deal with those data asymmetries that I explained at the beginning. Now, we also need to come up with new sustainability models, and so we're also working with a variety of initiatives on thinking through what are new business models for data collaboration. This here is an example of a new data trust that we help set up called Place, where drone data will be made available for urban mapping purposes. And the whole idea here is to establish a club good where then members, both commercial and non-commercial, will pay for having access to data, but it will be at a lower price range than you normally would have. And of course, if there is a non-commercial purpose, then it will also be more accessible, for instance. And so it's a way to actually sustain access to data in a more democratic way as well, that otherwise would be very hard to get. Next slide. There was also, of course, anyway, as I said, part of sustainability is to actually lower the transaction costs. And one of the key transaction costs in setting up data collaborations is actually legal, because a lot of this of course, is still structured through data sharing agreements. And the moment lawyers arrive, it becomes complicated. Partly because we don't have a streamlined data sharing agreement that can facilitate an easier way to actually structuring those data sharing agreements. And so we have developed an initiative called Contracts for Data Collaboration, where we have developed a template or at least a methodology to demystify data sharing agreements, because it's not that hard to write a data sharing agreement. You just need to know what are the elements that needs to go in it, and how do you structure it. And also, we now have developed a blockchain-based smart contract for data sharing agreements as well, that got the FD Collaborative Innovation Award as well, that will facilitate easier access to data as well, and that will be a way to lower the transaction cost for data collaboration. Next slide. Now, we also need, of course, make data more liquid. So we also have been working on data portability and how do we make data more liquid, because that's also, of course, standards are a key barrier quite often in actually making data more available. Next slide. Now, clearly, there's also a whole range of risks involved when sharing data, and quite often there is no real good risk assessment with regard to how one structures a data collaborative engagement or initiative, no matter what model you are adopting. And so towards that end, we have developed a data responsibility journey, which is an interactive tool that data stewards can use in order to assess the different aspects that one needs to consider across the data lifecycle when we are thinking about data reuse, right? Using data for other purposes than initially intended. And so that data responsibility journey has now been used by many data stewards in order not to come up with immediate solutions, but to really to identify areas where they should prioritize some mitigation strategies, right? And it ranges, as I said, from challenges as it relates to how data was collected and the provenance of data, to ultimately, anyway, challenges with regard to not knowing how data could potentially be misused, right? And how do we anticipate, if you start sharing data, anticipate possible misuses depending on the context in which you, of course, are operating as well. Next slide. Now, a key element as well, in addition to generating trust among the parties, right, between those that have data and those that need data, is of course also establishing trust in society as it relates to the reuse of data. Because we are talking about, as I said, the reuse of data that was collected for one purpose, and now we start using it for another purpose, which means that the typical mechanisms of consent are quite often limited in actually overseeing and steering that kind of engagement. There's also, from my point of view, and I've been public on multiple occasions, one of the biggest policy challenges that we have as it relates to data is how do we facilitate data reuse, which is the real opportunity actually in the data ecosystem because of the unique characteristics of data as it relates to being able to, anyway, reused without loss of quality and without actually additional kind of cost, which is the real kind of societal opportunity, but also from a policy point of view, the real headache, right? Because it's still based upon this consent concept where you can only use the data for which the individual has consented for. And so we need, anyway, from my point of view, we really need to go beyond those consent management systems, while still very important. And we need to establish a social license for the use of data. And so what we've been experimenting with is how do you actually establish those social licenses for particular kind of reuses. And so here in New York, we've created something called the Data Assembly, which is a citizens' assembly around the reuse of data. The initial focus was on, of course, how do you reuse, for instance, telecom data for COVID-19 purposes here in New York, right? And so here we co-designed with citizens and residents of New York City a governance framework under which data can be reused. And that in itself established then trust and also a social license. But we need a lot more experimentation in how you go about social license. And as I said, go beyond individual consent, because quite often the value of the data benefits society and should not just be, of course, steered by individuals expressing their expectations, right? And I think that's the complex kind of policy environment that we need to figure out how to do better. Next slide. And that's my last slide, I guess, is that ultimately this requires, of course, a broader public and societal engagement, because we are talking about asymmetries, right? Data asymmetries that automatically, right, fuel new power asymmetries. And I think data collaboratives are at the heart and should be at the heart of actually advancing a more equitable society around data. And I think we need a lot more public engagement, which is why I'm always delighted to have the opportunity to engage with people like yourself to really think about how do we actually have a conversation in which we focus on data asymmetries that goes quite often beyond purely technical considerations, but really start thinking about how do we make access to data more of a societal demand, because we will need all data on deck in order to deal with a lot of the societal challenges that we currently have. And unfortunately, a lot of the data we need is still locked up, and we have not found a way to unlock that in a more systematic, sustainable, right? Because this will all will need to be funded, and more importantly, responsible way as well. And so I think we need a data collaborative movement, not just a set of practices. Next slide. So with that, I've probably taken too much time already, Stefan, of what you normally had hoped to be more of a dialogue. But I think what I hope to convey here is that data collaborations, anyway, is an opportunity that we need to nurture more. We need to be sensitive that there is no one way of doing this, but we also need to focus on more building ecosystems and foundations that can nurture data collaborations in a more systematic, sustainable, and responsible way. So with that, over to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much. And I will open the floor for questions.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, Stefan. This is Indra Gopal here. How are you?
Great. Fine. How are you?
Yeah. Thank you so much for speaking at this in this forum. I really appreciate your presentation, and thanks a lot for sharing with us. I guess my question actually is, I have several questions, but I'll start with a couple of them and then give others a chance as well. But one question I had was regarding your comment about questions, right? I mean, you said, well, the way you generate demand is by trying to kind of have a more systematic way of asking questions. But our experience, I mean, we're as I think I might have mentioned, we're doing this thing called the Urban Data Exchange, and our experience is it's questions might be one thing, but actually very often the demand is created by applications and services, right? Not really by the questions, right? So for example, you mentioned things like urban mobility data, and you can ask questions about it, but actually what you can really do is you can use that data to improve the way in which citizens commute, or the way you can plan your traffic patterns, or bus routes and things like that. And that actually ends up being really what drives the demand for data. So I just wondered, you talked about questions, but really, at least my perception is it's more applications and services. And I just wondered what you thought about that, whether that was part of your broader definition of questions or?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And again, I'm always sensitive to indeed, not overdo the point I want to make by saying is that it always has to be driven by a question, but it's really about trying to define the problem that one seeks to solve or the opportunity that one seeks to address in a more pronounced way, right? Because what I really want to do is to shift the mindset that one needs to start from the data, right? That is available in order to then see what we can do, and that we actually should spend more time, right, on what's the problem we seek to address, right? And so, is it traffic jams, right? Is it problem of access to multimodal transportation platforms, right? Is it more safe access for instance, females to take public transportation, right? Is it a problem of lack of productivity because we are standing at the bus stop for hours without knowing when the bus comes, right? And so that's the real kind of argumentation, is that let's not assume that anyway, because you have access to data, let's not assume that the data will give you the answer if you don't have thought about what is it that you really need to know, right, in order to make a change. And that also, by the way, anyway, informs, of course, applications, right? So applications with regard to, the fact that I go on my iPhone now and see when the next subway is going to pass at the closest subway station that I am based upon my location is actually a question, right? The question is, when is the next subway, when is the next subway train going to be here, so that I know where to go and when to show up, right? And so many of the applications can be translated into questions, but also I'm mainly interested also, of course, in informing public decision making through data. And that requires quite often that we need to start, right, in order to do so, we need to start by really understanding, do we actually know the baseline, right, that we want to change? And that's a question, right? So it's basically a situation analysis question for which we need data. Then the second type of questions is quite often, do we actually know, right, why we are in the current situation? And that's, again, a data question where we try to do causality and correlations understanding. And then the third kind of questions is then, anyway, do we actually know how this will evolve based upon now our deeper understanding of what explains why we are in current situation, right? Meaning that if X happens and Y happens, then we can assume, right, that we will have X or Z happening, right? And so these are kind of the predictive kind of questions. And then, of course, the impact assessment questions, right, is then really, have we actually made a difference vis-a-vis the baseline based upon questions, right? And so that's the kind of applications, right, that we are, where we are trying to formulate a more sophisticated kind of questioning, because we engage with public officials and even private decision makers on many occasions, and they say we need data, right, for improving our decisions, but then they don't have a clear understanding what is the question that will drive their decision making, right? And so that's the real exercise.
No, it's a good point. I mean, I think the other aspect actually is that I think you're right. They are underlying questions. I mean, whenever you look at any application there, as you said,
right.
Look at when is the next subway train going to show up? There is an underlying question there. But ultimately, what makes it sustainable, at least in our perception, and I wonder whether you agree with this, is there is some economic value that's being created, right? That application of the service that might in turn ask a question is generating some economic benefit, right? It either to the citizen or through advertise, whatever the business model is, or maybe reducing costs to the city or whoever, and that in turn creates the demand for the data, right? I mean, that's really, it's the economics, I think, that drives the sustainability of that overall ecosystem. And that's again something that I didn't see directly in your talk. You didn't really talk about the economics and the way in which that sustainability works. But I wonder what.
Well, in part, and again, these are very good points, right? And in part because the economic valuation of data is still in its in its early days of methodological development, from my point of view. Because, like, for instance, I can make for every, question, and we do that exercise quite often. Of course, our main interest at GovLab is, improving society. So there's clear societal value quite often in answering and using data, right? But then what we try to do as well is then, so what does that mean from an economic valuation point of view? And there, I have to say, it's all proxies, right? Quite often, and it's and I think we do need to make that case for sure. For instance, I was an advisor to the European Commission with regard to business to government data sharing, and so the real question there was then, so what's the the cost or economic benefit of having access to private sector data for societal purposes, right? And so, big question. We don't really have a good methodology to assess that, except for using proxies. For instance, we do know, right, that if you manage traffic jams in a city, right, turns out there's actually a good there is some economic valuation that traffic jams, for instance, in New York City, cost every resident about $2,000 to $3,000 on an annual basis, right, of loss in economic gains. So if you would improve by having better management, right, of road traffic as a result of access to private sector data, improve it with 1%, then you have kind of a number that is in the billions, right? And but that's as you know, in there, that's very estimates, right? And so I totally agree with you, is that it's the economic gain and the economic value proposition that drives the decision. But we do need a lot more investment in actually developing a methodology and data points to make that kind of evaluation, right? And the reason why I'm not talking about it is because I feel like it's hard to do, right?
Yep.
And again, if you have suggestions, let me know on how you would go about this. Right?
I mean, we could certainly have a lot more discussion, but let me have others. I think there's some other questions on the. Let me.
There's a question in chat from Ayushi. So
I can't see the chat either. I'm sorry. I mean,
that's not an issue. But Ayushi, are you able to ask a question? Otherwise, I would read it from the chat.
Am I audible?
Yes. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Stefan. Thank you for the very nice conversation. I have two questions. The first one is, in data collaboratives that aim at pooling private sector data, say data from private arbitration institutions, where the data is well spread among the data providers, unlike, say, a Google that has far more data than its competitors. In a setting where that's not the case and data is far more widespread, isn't more the data better the insights for all the service providers? And is this a good incentive for data providers to share their data, since they are private sector data providers? And or there are better incentives that you can possibly think of? And my second question is, in your experience, are there any examples where private sector data providers have agreed to pool data without an economic incentive?
Yeah. Well, so seems to me the overall question is about incentives, right? And clearly, when it's widely distributed, then I think you do need to think about how do you set up a platform for access, which is why quite often, again, if it's fit for purpose, then quite often it's more of an intermediary that one needs. And by the way, a key role that I see is actually industry associations that can play some of that kind of intermediary kind of role. And I think we will see a lot more of that playing out as well in the future. But the but as it relates to the incentives, yeah, no, there are clear, quite often, well, what we have identified 9 types of incentives. We call them the 9 R's of data collaboration. And they range from, for instance, an incentive with regard to reciprocity, right? So where you have access to something that you otherwise would not have because you now share something as well, right? And I would not underestimate the reciprocity rationale, especially in certain kinds of sectors such as the pharmaceutical sector or even the car manufacturing sector, where they need access to car safety data so that they actually have a better understanding on, for instance, car safety challenges that they then collectively or anyway individually can address in order to improve car safety, for instance, right? So reciprocity is a key element, and also reciprocity could also be access to data expertise that you quite often don't have, and we see a lot of that where private sector anyway provides access to the data because they don't really have the skills quite often internally to experiment and innovate. But then once they have a new model that was developed through this data collaboration, then can quite often monetize it for other services as well. But then there are other incentives, including reputation gains, right, which is under the challenge quite often with regard to open washing, right, where they only share data just briefly to gain some reputation. And of course, we've seen a lot of that, for instance, with Meta and even the Googles of the world during COVID-19, where they really, anyway, contributed, of course, to our insight, but there was also a clear kind of reputation gain, brand equity kind of strategy attached to it, which, anyway, I have no problem with as long as it improves society as well. But then there are other, of course, objectives. As you know, many corporations are moving into, anyway, in the corporate social responsibility space, are moving into the ESG kind of environment. And we see a lot of discussions now, like, for instance, Microsoft, where they are looking into, well, what's our role towards meeting environmental goals as it relates to contributing data that can improve, for instance, environmental sustainability as well, right? And so we have a lot of those examples where, anyway, data is being shared to manage the oceans better because of an environmental corporate social responsibility role as well. But by the end of the day, of course, anyway, there's always has to be some kind of a business case because they are, anyway, businesses, and it could be a combination of those kinds of incentives. Other incentives could be, for instance, actually retaining talent. Turns out that there's a massive competition among data to gain and retain data scientists, and being able to, anyway, work, for instance, UN organizations around their data quite often is a good incentive for attracting and retaining the best data scientists as well, that clearly want to be well paid, but also want to contribute to society beyond, for instance, optimizing advertising clicks, right? And so there's a whole range of incentives that we have identified that one can package. Now that determines also, again, kind of a function within the organization that can really make that case, because otherwise it's a hard sell sometimes.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Any additional questions? If Inda, yeah.
No, well, I mean, actually, I have one question. If nobody else does, I mean, there's a lot of terminology that you introduced, Stefan, right? I mean, you talked about data collaboratives, data trusts, data exchanges, data whatever. I mean, and it just seems like there's like a zillion different terms which I mean, I don't even know exactly what they all mean, and very often they all mean they have overlapping meaning.
Right.
I just wondered if there's some, in your view, is there some organization of the terminology in this space? Do we have some, some standardization of the terminology?
Yeah. No.
Are you trying to do that? Maybe that's something perhaps that you could maybe help the field with, maybe so I mean, it just seems very confusing. I mean,
if only, yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And there is no shortage of terminology that is being introduced on a weekly basis, right? And I think there is need, yeah. I mean, it ranges from, anyway, we've been using data collaborative since 2015 because there was no other, and again, we use it deliberately broadly because quite often there is also an ideological discussion about this is the only way you can do it, right? And so what I've tried to prevent is not go into that way, is that, anyway, it has to be a data trust, right? Otherwise, you're not doing it the right way, or it has to be an exchange because otherwise you're not, collaborating meaningfully. But I do agree is that now that and this is typically in areas that are new, right, is that you have a proliferation of vocabulary. And because we don't have the vocabulary, people are creating the vocabulary, and then it becomes confusing, it becomes a Tower of Babylon. But I think eventually I do feel that we will settle, right, as the practices becoming more standardized. I think we will also settle on more kind of standardization. I mean, my view is that this goes quite often hand in hand with the creation of new professions, right? Just think on many other professions that have been created where there was a massive confusion quite often and diversity of terms, but then the profession quite often establishes a way of doing things and establishes kind of an agreement on vocabulary as well. And I think my view is that we need this data stewards profession, and we need a professional association for data stewards that can professionalize and standardize some practices, but also then the vocabulary that we use when we talk about a data pool or a data cooperative. What is it that we are really talking about? When we talk about a data trust, what is it that we are really talking about? When we talk about a data platform, what is it that we really talk about? And I think we will get there eventually, but now it's still a little bit indeed in the kind of Wild West, and every week there's another term, whether it's data institutions or whether it's data sovereignty, that no one really knows what it means, right? But that's an expression of where we are at the moment.
Yep.
I have another question if we have the time.
Yes. I have another.
So, Stephen, could you give some guidance on how does, say I'm a lawyer and I'm trying to set up a data institution in the justice space?
Right.
How should I go about it? What should be the playbook? I have gone through the collaboratives.org. Any more insight would shed on it?
Yeah, well, as always, I think it's important to focus on the purpose. And I think that would be my step number one, and especially if you want to build a legal construct around it, I think, of course, it should serve the purpose, right? And so I think being crystal clear about the purpose, then once you, of course, have multiple parties involved, then it's going to be about how you're going to govern decision-making with regard to the purpose and the principles, of course, that if this is an organization, the principles that you have agreed upon will guide the decision making within the entity. And again, is this an organization with multiple parties, or is this a single data owner and holder that then wants to provide access to data for a particular kind of purposes? I think that's going to be important. But then, of course, it's really about establishing the purpose, establishing the decision-making processes and ways on how you will come to certain kinds of decisions, whether this is a board that needs to be set up that can anyway comply with the bylaws that you have created that enshrine the principles and the purpose for which the organization exists. But then, of course, you also need to start thinking about what are then governance devices. Is this a data sharing agreement that you need to establish? Is it licensing arrangements that you need to have in order then to provide access to the data? Is it a code of conduct? Is it a memorandum of understanding that you need to establish? And how are you going to go about disputes, right? So happy, Ayushi, to go into more detail. But typically, anyway, start with the purpose and the principles. And that quite often means, anyway, you need to have some document where that is clear. Sometimes from a legal perspective, that's a bylaw. But then, of course, it's really about who's going to make decisions about what's the function of the board, what's the function of staff, how you're going to structure access, data sharing agreements, licensing, open licensing, and so on. And how are you going to deal with disputes as well? And I think that would be a good start, perhaps, Ayushi.
Thank you.
If you have time for one more question, I think I
Yes.
have Abhilash here. Abhilash, go ahead. Abhilash? Okay, he raised his hand, but he's not asking. Someone else has another question?
I think people are ready for their weekend, Stefan, perhaps.
Could be, yes. So
well, I can ask another question.
Okay, Ayushi, why don't you go ahead?
Perhaps one from my end. Could you lead me towards organizations, especially in India, since we are dealing with justice space and we would want it to be more local, who could help us with the governance of a data institution dealing with justice data?
Organizations in India?
Yeah.
I will have to think about that, Ayushi. I'm not meaning. There are several people working, of course, in India, and I think some of you, of course, know better than I do, for sure, around data collaboratives. But I'm not sure in the justice space as well. I'm gonna have to think about this. Stefan, again, unfortunately, I don't have access to the chat here, but Stefan can share with you my details, and so perhaps we can exchange bilaterally on a few options here. But I will have to think about this.
Sure, I will do that in the chat right away.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Okay.
Okay. If there are no more questions, Inda, you want to close off the session?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I mean, I think it's been really great. I really, really appreciate, Stefan, your, I don't know exactly what time it is in New York, but probably relatively early in the morning. So thanks for.
It's feasible, being it's only 8:30.
All right. Well, great. Anyway, I guess you woke up a little bit earlier than that. So thanks so much. Really appreciate it, and really look forward to continuing the dialogue. I think this has been really, really great, and we hope to have many more discussions with you, and keep the connection going. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, and eager to learn more about all your great work as well. And as I said, this is still all is still under development, right? And I think we can learn from each other for sure. And I think those kinds of exchanges is really what are always valuable for me as well, to actually learn what other people are working on. So keep in the loop.
Great.
Take care. Bye bye.
So much. Great.
Thank you, Stefan. Bye.